Hey guys, we're back again with another figure kit. This time we're going to be looking at another one of Volks' Charagumin kits, this time with their 1/8 scale Joan of Arc. Let's open her on up and take a look. Now, because of how this kit is packaged, we're going to be doing this a little more slowly today, simply because a lot of the parts are bagged together and there are a large number of small and very delicate parts, so this will be a little different. As normally I've got all the parts fully unbagged, but yeah, I want to keep everything together. So first up, we've got the two halves to her skirt. Now, one issue you will encounter when dealing with resin kits that you will not encounter when working with plastic kits is issues with fitment. And in the case of the skirt, if you'll give me 1 second to get everything sort of lined up, it's not that great. Now, this is mainly due to just a combination of the nature of the material and how molds age and where the kit happens to be in the life of the mold. And in this case, I think my copy may have been further down the line, that or it's possible they popped it out of the mold just that much too soon, or what have you, a combination of things. But at least in the case of mine, obviously, fit's not that great. This can be corrected with either boiling the parts in hot water so that they get loose. You can sort of stretch and bend them a little, or alternatively, using something like a heat gun. Regardless, yeah, on that fit issue, the quality of resin feels quite good, and the overall design to the skirt does provide some interesting drama. Here's me why I get this back in. Okay. Now, moving on. As I said, I'm going to be dealing a little differently. We're going to take each of these out in turn, and we'll talk about them individually and then return them, just because I don't want everything going sort of everywhere. So bear with me. So starting off, we've got one of her bows and the hilt to the sword. And hopefully this is showing up on camera. Of her nice sculpting to the parts. Now, one common trait I noticed on this kit is that a large number of the parts have some odd choices of where they did the pour stubs. Obviously, with things being here and on other similar parts, going to make cleanup a lot more difficult. You'll see this more as we go. Next part up, we've got her sort of, I'm going to call it tunic, as the sort of what's the best word to describe the underpart for her sort of cape part. That's probably the best way I'm going to be able to describe it. But or does a nice job of capturing the details there. Moving on, we've got her shoulder parts, which you do, and hopefully this will show up on camera. Some very fine detailing on the cuffs of it. Again. Okay. Next up, we've got our flesh parts, including the face, which I feel they did a very good job. And in comparison to a lot of the parts on this kit, they actually had a sensible location for the port stub. Detailing is quite nice. Now, as it said in previous Charagumin kit review, since all the parts are done in colored resin, does mean you technically don't need to paint, but flesh parts generally look the best if you do give them coat of paint. The same will be true here. Next up, we've got her upper legs and thighs. Do have a bit of seam lining here from the molding process, but beyond that, there's no real issues I can see that jump out at me. Now, interestingly, and this is part of the reason that you do get to not have to technically paint, as this is her lower abdomen above the panty line, as instead of doing this as part of that, they instead did it as a separate part, which is a bit interesting, even though most of this will get covered up. Granted, again, they did choose to put the pour stub on the outer side instead of doing like an undergate. But yeah. Okay, next up, we start getting into her various armor pieces. Again, much like the cuff parts, there is a surprising amount of fine detailing to these parts. Now, obviously, in this sort of gray color, they're not going to have the same effect as if you've got them painted up in a nice metallic. So that is something to take with a grain of salt. Again, I do believe poor choice on pour stubs abounds, but is what it is. Turning on more armor parts and also her bottom of her feet. Again, much the same level of detailing. And as I've said before, hopefully showing up. There's other bits. Now, moving on, we have more parts to her sword, including some very delicate banding that wraps around, which we'll see more in detail once we get into the instruction sheet. And that definitely add a lot of interest and complication to this kit. More of the armor details down to her knee and elbow joints. Again, this is a very complicated kit that will take some time, but will be very well rewarded once you do complete it. Into the home stretch now with this. Some more armor, additional parts. Again, this is part of the reason why we're doing this particular review in this more slow and methodical method. Again, more of the armor detail parts, this time for her wrists. Very poor stub locationing. This is definitely one where they could have been a little smarter. Moving on now on to her hands. Obviously, this is where they've done a very delicate job of sculpting all the armor bits over her gloves. And again, a lot of subtle detailing there. Next up, we've got her main torso. Fortunately, they did choose to pour stubs right there, smack in the middle, so you will have to clean those up. Again, much the same level of detailing as the other parts. And thankfully, none of this is damaged anyway, as unfortunately resin is a more brittle material than plastic, so you do have to be a bit more careful. Okay, I'm going to try to do these as best I can, as these unfortunately were loose. Starting with her sort of tiara piece. This, thankfully, they put the pour stubs in a location that won't be seen. But, oops. Again, very subtle and fine detailing. Definitely a piece that if you take your time and do the work, all that detail is going to just absolutely pop. Now onto her necklace. I do apologize if I'm getting a little redundant. Just the sheer volume of small, very brittle parts is getting a little excessive. But it does mean you're going to spend a lot of time working on some very detailed parts. Now, as far as that chain piece, I almost wonder if it might be smarter and more interesting if you were to replace it with an actual chain, as that could add a new layer of detail. But that is a little bit out into the weeds, as it were. Now, a very interesting choice they went with was to have her with a sword. Now, in Fate games and the anime, you don't really see her with a sword at all. You typically see her with her banner, something which they don't include in this kit in any way, shape, or form. I'm not aware of any additional release versions of this kit where it might have the sword, or excuse me, the banner, but we do get her sword, which by itself is a finely detailed piece, especially once you add on the additional parts. It does have a little bit of a bend to it, but that's easy enough to fix. Continue on, we do have her sheath, which will eventually get a fair number of those smaller arts added on to further detail it. As it is, it's kind of plain. Now, moving on to her legs next. Thankfully, they were smart with the pore stubs. Some subtle detailing in her knee area for some of the bends. But overall, very nice piece. No seam lines, nothing. They did a good job with those. More of her shoulder parts. Again, very subtle. Actually, I take that back. This is actually part of her sort of cape bit on top. They do have very fine way of molding all of the folds in the cloth. Finally, we do have her main upper torso part. Again, very subtle bits of detailing all around. And thankfully, fairly smart pore stub placement. Continuing on now, we finally got some her interlocking other small detail bits. We also have rest of her shoes. Again, not as impressive until you get some paint on it. More clothes. Some more cuff parts. And some additional detailing bits to add on to the sheath and sword. Last up, we have her lower torso. Again, because they do these parts in color, that upper section's done as a separate part. Almost done, folks. Okay. Last but not least, we finally move on to her hair. Sculpting on the hair is more than adequate. Thankfully, no breakages for any of the follicles, though pore stub might cause a little bit of problems. Now, For her ponytail, they've actually done a very fantastic job of capturing all the hair's fine details and lines. So they did a fantastic job there. Similarly, with her front bit. And no, that's not a pour stub. That's actually for her little tiara thing. And thankfully here, they did use a undergate for the pour stub. So they do redeem themselves a little and do know how to do pour stub. And then lastly, we have this last little end bit for her hair. Nice little extra. Excuse me while I get these back in. And then we'll look at the instruction manual. Oh, before I forget, kit does come with a set of decals for the eyes. Thankfully, they give you 2 sets in case you have an issue with the first. Now, on to building her up. Start with in the head and building all of this up. Again, a lot of small detailing, so you're going to need to take your time and think this out. Doubly so if you're going to be painting. You're going to need to be careful and be prepared to do a combination of masking and or repainting some sections as you go. And again, with all resin kits, test fit, test fit, test fit. Time you spend there will save you a lot of headaches down the road. Now, once you get into building up her torso, it's where things get really complicated. All the bits of armor you're going to need to put together. Again, test fit, see where you can do sub-assemblies. That will save you some time and effort. No breaks once you move down to her lower torso. And similarly, as I said before, very interesting knot type detailing on her sword. Pretty basic paint guide, though they don't give you a translation for the paint. They just sort of give you a general color. And then final assembly, and this is what you should hopefully end up with at the end. So, overall, this is a significantly more complicated and complex resin kit than the one we looked at previously. It's a lot more detailed and is going to be a lot more time consuming. But apologies for that. You're going to want to take a lot more time with this. Don't rush it. And believe it or not, this is actually not one of the most complicated kits they have. They do have ones that are a lot more. So be aware of that. And obviously, if you do take your time and do it right, you'll reap the rewards of a fantastic looking resin kit. So that was a look at Volks' 1/8 scale Joan of Arc. Very detailed and very complicated kit. So until next time.